welcome to all of you. Thank you for joining us this morning. I'm going to just jump right into this. What we're going to do is about 40 minutes of questions from me, and then I'm going to turn it over to the audience, and you can use the Q&A function on the chat. There's a chat on Zoom. So just add your questions there, and we'll get to them in about 40 minutes. So let's just start off with, obviously, a lot of colleges ended last term early. And went to virtual learning. Can you, I'm just gonna throw this out to all of the presidents, sort of what was that experience like at your universities? How did that go? And does it set you up well if you have to go to virtual for next year? I think some of you might be on mute.
I'll jump in. We normally have a number of students who were taking classes online and using our platform. So it wasn't as disruptive. I think for us, part of the learning was that having conversations not only with faculty and staff, but with students, is that people really started to miss, how we brand and how we deliver our education as a small liberal arts HBCU. And so that was the main thing I kept hearing from people, is like, okay, this was okay, but we really value being there together. That's the strength of our institution. So it was really more of that sense of loss of not having those kinds of experiences. A lot of people, I think, were nervous about the grades, but, we did a study that, and I told students, don't be worried about it. I think people are going to give you a lot of grace. And so we had, the best GPA for a semester in the 8 years I've been here. So that was a benefit for everybody. They were, but people really want to be back. So, I mean, just like everybody else, it was chaotic and we had to work through that. But I think there was some familiarity with our platform, which helped. But I think really for us, everybody took away a different level of appreciation for what we do on a day-to-day basis.
So we were starting from scratch. We had no online learning at Grinnell College, and we had about 1,600 students in 50 states and 50 countries. We were about 20% international. So that created real challenges. But overall, everyone said it worked, but it was not pretty. I think it took us a while to get the hang of things. We're now devoting a lot of resources to getting it right and doing it better. And we also went to grade optional. And so a lot of students chose to take pass fail. And I think that reassured everyone that there was more flexibility. But we did it, and I think students managed to get through. Faculty were phenomenal. Higher ed is criticized for not being able to change much. There was a lot of change in a very short period of time on our campuses, and I think they did overall did well given the constraints.
Yeah, and we pivoted very quickly. In fact, we were one of the first to come out and say, I made the decision that we were going to get off campus as quickly as possible. It's relative. The truth is we had a lot of students whose home was VCU. We had 1,000 students who actually remained on campus. However, we did stop classroom activity. Our faculty did an unbelievable job of pivoting very, very rapidly to online and various forms of remote education. It really pushed us very quickly into boot camp. So I had been advancing a lot with regard to the whole online environment. We've made significant investments. Glad we did. It worked out well to our advantage. The real challenges we face, we have a largely in-state student population of very high need. About a third of our students do not come from homes in which their families went to college. So that interaction with faculty becomes really more of a mentorship. And that was missing. The other real challenge that we faced was that a lot of our students just did not have sufficient devices, didn't have laptops, didn't even have phones that would work as well as they needed to for Zooms and so on and so forth. A lot of students that come to VCU did not have broadband, and they couldn't go someplace with broadband. As you know, places like coffee shops were all shut down that often offer broadband. So it was a real challenge. We made devices available to everyone so that they could actually try to pick up broadband. But if you don't have broadband, and you don't have a cell tower, it doesn't matter, right? So you're in a jam. The other issue we face that most people wouldn't think of, that we've heard a lot from our students, is they went home. And when they went home, they found it very difficult because they didn't have their own room. So Zooming was not something that was easy. They had to be on mute the whole time. You can't go outside when it's raining with your laptop or your phone or whatever. So that was a real challenge. But that just connection to the professors was and other staff was really, really very, very difficult for a lot of our students. But they've made it through. We've made it through. We've learned a lot. And there's no question that what we're doing this summer in terms of our boot camps, training, and so on and so forth for faculty and students is heavily influenced by a lot of what we learned in the spring in that quick pivot. On the whole, everyone did well. We gave students the option for pass fail. Most did not take it. Most did very well and got decent grades. At least that what students thought were decent grades.
Great. Okay. Well, that's all good to hear. So at least if we have to go to virtual, it sounds like the transition's already there. Obviously, we'll need some perfecting, but that's helpful to know. I do want to start with I want to go to Dr. Kimbrough now because Dillard is. I want to talk a little bit about how you're approaching this decision to reopen. You're located in New Orleans, and although you weren't there at the time, New Orleans has some experience as being part of a big recovery and rebuilding process post-Katrina. Can you talk about the university's role in the city and the recovery and how that past experience may be shaping how you approach this and sort of just the decision making in terms of how you decided to reopen in person?
Right. So I think New Orleans is a really resilient city, and that's part of the spirit. I think when you come here, even though you realize that the Katrina experience was longer than just the fall of 2005. I mean, Dillard's campus was almost completely flooded. We didn't really get back on the campus until a year later, where every other institution in the city was back on campus. And you'll still see places in the city that are still vacant from where there were properties that have not been rebuilt since Katrina. I got here in the summer of 2012. We didn't open up all of our residence halls in terms of completing the renovations until January of 2014. So we understand long processes, and that, could be part of that here. I talk a lot about this. Louisiana had a huge spike in the beginning. New Orleans had a huge spike, and we're a place that a lot of those comorbidities exist. So we're having a lot of conversations here about health disparities as a city that has a high African-American population, low wages. And so that's a part of what we think about, where about half of our students, 60%, come from Louisiana, in a state that isn't one of the healthiest states. Part of our thinking is, not so much students getting sick, because in the state of Louisiana, about 2,900 people have died, and 10 of them have been between the ages of 18 and 29. So we don't expect that, but we know that the students could then get family members sick or faculty and staff sick. And those are the things that we think about. But as Dr. Rao mentioned too, I'm hearing from students who are saying, you gotta be open, because I'm in Chicago and I would take my chances in New Orleans with coronavirus than being here in Chicago. And I'm hearing that directly from students, where there's greater food and housing insecurity at home than there is at Dillard. So that makes it a very complicated, calculus for us, when we're trying to figure out the situation here in New Orleans, the situation at home for students. So, for now, we're working toward having that on-campus experience, realizing some students and families will decide to stay home, which is perfectly fine. But we know we have students that this is still the best place and the safest place for them as well. So we're adding all of that in. So, it's fascinating when you look at all the factors that are involved in a city like New Orleans, which still is a very resilient city, but those are the challenges we're looking at.
So on the other side of that, Dr. Kington, you lead a school that's located in a relatively rural state, and some of the largest universities there have decided to reopen. I think you all are going back partially in person. How are you approaching that, and how are you working with the local leaders and your peers at other schools to make those decisions?
Well, it is a different equation. We're in a small town of 9,000 people. There is no public transportation. So that's not an issue at all. In other school places, it's a big issue with their staff. And from the very beginning, we've had regular calls and with all the leaders of the town. And one thing that's great about a small town is relatively easy to get everyone on the same phone. Head of police, head of fire department, head of the hospital, head of the employers, the town manager, everyone. And we've been working together. And I think we're in a pretty good place. We're opening with a low density campus. So we normally have 1,100 or so students on campus and another 200 or so in the town and the rest in various places. But we're starting off with about 500 to 600 is sort of where we're headed now, for lots of reasons. One, we think that we're going to learn a lot because, like every other campus, we're changing 1,000 variables at the exact same time. And we know that there are going to be unexpected consequences. But we think we have an obligation to start. We think we can do it relatively safely. And as Dr. Kimbrough just mentioned, every place has to balance its own risk and opportunity and needs of its student. The equation is different, literally, in every single institution. The equation is different. In our assessment, for example, we had about 130 students who remained on campus for all the reasons that are usual, that everyone has, either insecurity at home for whatever reason or not able to get into their home country. So what was good about that, it gave us sort of a trial run of sort of how you operate. And it's complicated. It's complicated. But we think we can do it. And then what we hope to do, we also reduced we normally have a 14-week semester. We reduced it now to 7.5 weeks with 2 courses at a time. And we think that will work better for lots of reasons. We think it's easier to expect behavioral change in 7.5 weeks versus 14 weeks. And we also think that it will allow us to be sort of more surgical in shutting down or opening up. And a number of the residential liberal arts colleges have moved to this shorter term. And we're doing lots and lots of testing. We decided that for us, testing was really important.
Okay, great, thank you. And I think, so Dr. Rao, obviously VCU is in the heart of Richmond, a much larger school than Grinnell. How are you looking at these issues in terms of reopening? You are in an urban setting. Up until recently, urban settings have been hit a little bit harder by the virus. We are seeing it more in more urban areas now, but walk us through what you all are thinking for the fall.
Yeah, so there are some advantages for us. One of which is that we're a university, but we're also the state's largest safety net hospital as well. And so there are some resources there. There are also some challenges there. And when I was listening to Dr. Kimbrough talk, I was thinking about how difficult it was for us when we took the reaction that we did to SARS coronavirus 2 and decided that we would effectively shut down. What that did in the minds of a lot of patients, unfortunately, even though they were not barred from coming to the hospital, is we saw an 80% drop in cancer patients, 40% drop in cardiovascular patients. They didn't all just get healed. And that drop stayed for about 2 months. And what worries me is, think about what's happening. Cardiovascular patients, for the most part, particularly in a safety net, cancer patients, they're largely underrepresented ethnic minorities. And so they're at a significant disadvantage. So communication became very difficult. Now we're seeing the patients return, but they're sicker and some have died. I hate to say it, but it's true. And everyone needs to know that. So how we handle this is going to be really important. The other advantages we have, though, here in the city are we're in the state capitol, so we've got the State Department of Health here. We work very closely with them. We have the city's Department of Health as well. We work very closely with them. We have surrounding counties as well, and we work with each of those. So you probably have followed the numbers in most of the states. I think we all have. Virginia had considerable number of cases and deaths, but really only about 12% of those here in the Richmond region. A lot of that was because we coordinated very effectively and worked together. And candidly, a lot of the cases were in nursing homes. So they were isolated, unfortunately, in those environments. And it's a very, very sad situation. I would tell you that while I'm telling you that there was only 12% here in Richmond, we're not out of the woods, because as we start to reopen, which we're doing right now, and we'll do so more as we get into the summer, we will have little spikes and waves that come along, and we need to be prepared to deal with those. So we are preparing to deal with those. We've learned a lot being an essential workforce here at VCU throughout the entire pandemic time. We've learned a lot, and it's helping us translate those skills into the university. It really encouraged me to just move forward and announce very early that we are going to open. Open means we'll be open, but not everything will be entirely like it was last year. There will be a lot of things that will be online, and much of that will be the decision of faculty members based on their needs and such. So the other thing I would say is, what we'll really pay attention to as we open is really focusing on outbreaks and how we identify and manage those outbreaks. The key to that is really being clear about what your outbreaks are and what your numbers are and how well that matches what's going on in the city, because you don't want to be the source of an outbreak in the city. You know, we have a responsibility to the city that we are a part of and very much intertwined with. And so you don't want to catalyze the spread of this virus from the university, and that can sometimes happen. And we've got to protect our students and their families. So we're also thinking about when they go back home, we don't want them to take something back home, wherever that might be. And for a lot of our students, it's going to be Northern Virginia, near the DC area, and certainly DC and Southern Maryland. So we feel a responsibility there as well.
Wow. Yeah, I don't envy any of you for having to make these decisions. I want to bring Peter in on this conversation because ACE represents a number of hundreds of higher education institutions. And so I'm curious, we just got 3 excellent examples of how universities are thinking about reopening and their approach to the fall. What are you kind of hearing from the members, the greater membership, about the key concerns? One issue in particular has come up. There's a question about liability concern, and BPC's of the mind that there is a middle ground to be found there, where people who are doing the best they can and complying with all the relevant guidance versus there are going to be egregious actors, and so not protecting them. So I'm curious, like, how much is that coming up in your conversations with your members? What other issues are they raising with you?
Yeah, look, there's no playbook for reopening America in this COVID-19 era. And I think we've caught wind in these 15 minutes so far too. There's really no playbook to reopening colleges. Our colleges are so vastly different. They sit within different geographic and social contexts. I was struck by something that I've heard this morning, that I've heard over and over and over, which is that risk is relative. And for students, for employees, particularly our lowest paid employees, it frankly could be healthier and safer to come to campus to work than be elsewhere. Never mind the economic benefit of that. So the obligations that these presidents and every president across the country have to balance the risks and the benefits of this is quite extraordinary. These risks are being categorized in hundreds of different places and ways on campuses every day. It's easy to talk about high risk, medium risk, and low risk, but people have to actually make decisions about what those are on the best available information, which frankly can change from day to day and week to week. So what do? We can be paralyzed, or we can say, as President Rao said early on at VCU, look, we're going to find a way to get ourselves back as safely and as aggressively as we can as a community, recognizing the concerns and needs and worries of our constituencies and our obligations to the broader community. When we start talking about liability, what we're really talking about is the fact that each of these presidents and presidents across the country are being asked to make judgments on the best information they have available. And unfortunately, it's just a reality that the judgments can be calibrated based upon economic worry and risk associated with lawsuits that can emanate in the nature of Monday morning quarterbacking. We don't know that school A on one side of town doing X will have a different outcome than school B on the other side of town doing Y. But if there is a different outcome, if there's an outbreak at X, well, maybe Y is held up as the standard they should have used 3 or 4 years later in a Monday morning quarterbacking context. That's what we're trying to avoid. let's raise the bar a bit on what's an appropriate time to say, you really intentionally misbehaved here. You were use a legal jargon, grossly negligent here. Require some level of specific pleading about that, rather than having these universities being called to account 3 or 4 years later for the 100 or 200 or 300 different decisions that need to be made to open and move forward for the fall and the spring.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. So even when we started planning this event a couple weeks ago and thinking through questions, and even in that time, the dynamic, what's happening in the country has changed. We're seeing spikes in areas that we thought were under control, and so it's just interesting. It's, again, my sympathies to anyone who has to try and figure out the best way forward. But I do want to talk a little bit about student life, because all three of you kind of touched on that a little bit, about how students miss that interaction with the faculty and the in-person stuff. One of the highlights of college, particularly as a freshman, is being in the dorms and dorm life. So presuming I think you all house folks in dorms, what does housing look like come fall?
I think it's going to be different. We know that is going to be different. But we're moving toward primarily single rooms. But we're forming sort of, as many schools are, some people use the term pods or cohorts or groups of students who will function more or less like a family, and in some cases take the same courses. But life is going to be changed. I had a student who wrote to me a very worried email saying, "You're radically changing life on campus." And I said, yes, we're radically changing. That's exactly what we're doing. And there's a good reason why we're doing it, because we can't do it the way we did it before. So we have to we're almost inventing new colleges and universities within our values and community and all the resources that we have, but we're having to reinvent how we operate. So staggered meals, just the array of things that have to change. I think most people would be stunned, because all our campuses are like little cities. And we're having to redesign the function and the movement and the operation and the look of large parts of that little city. But we're doing it. Our student life is taking a big role. And man, those folks we declared an extra holiday day on July 6th because everyone is just working nonstop and completely burning out. But because you have to redesign how the campus operates, and that's hard. And students it'll be a sacrifice, because people love the old way of doing things. It was great, and what's more, that's how people built relationships and friendships and social capital and all those things that make our schools special. But we're in a different world, so we have to adjust to that world. It's going to be different for a while. And we're all going to learn, because as much as we like to think in advance about all the answers to all the different things, what I'm learning is every time you answer one question, there are 10 more that come afterwards about what are you going to do about this? What are you going to do about that? And so you have to exercise a lot of judgment, because there's no randomized clinical trial somewhere that's going to tell us what to do. We're going to exercise judgment.
Yeah, I would say that we're in the same boat. We're doing a lot of the same things that Rainer described. We're going to give packages to every student, whether they live on campus or not, with a lot of things in it. I actually have a package. It includes face coverings, which will require people to use, and we have very clear guidelines as to where they have to be used. We're also working on what do you do when someone's going to refuse, and someone's going to refuse, if not many people. So we're trying to figure out how to manage that, and there will be some issues around the faculty member and what the faculty member wants to do with regard to someone who just says, I'm going to try to exercise, I'm going to make a point here and try to exercise my civil right to not wear one. So all that stuff's coming, and we need to be prepared for it. The other things, there'll be hand sanitizer everywhere. We've all been, looking at some of the science coming out of recent, which says that, it's likely that touching surfaces is not nearly as high a risk as breathing somebody else's droplets and being too close to people. So the key really is not to shut everything down, but to figure out how you truly distance people from each other so that they don't spread. from one to another. That's a real challenge in our environment because, you know, if you talk honestly with most university presidents or even faculty members, ask them if they really think most students will social distance. The answer is it's unlikely that they all will. I think many will. I also think many will not. And so that's where the key to this really is how you're going to identify and manage outbreaks when they happen so that they don't spread out into the cities that we're a part of or the communities that we're a part of or whatever. The only thing I would add to what Raynard said is we're also setting aside a significant number of isolation or quarantine rooms. We need to do that because we do know that there will be outbreaks. And when we identify them, we have to find places for our students to go. And we're sticking with the 14 days. There are some theories around 8 days. We don't necessarily feel like there's enough evidence for that yet, but we are going to stick with the 14 days and give students new homes. The other thing that we're trying to do is bring students together to understand what it means to not just be in a small city together, but what does it mean to be a family? And so we can't do one person to a room because so many of our rooms are so large, but we will not do more than 2. And so when you are together, you know, what are the behaviors and so on that you have to really focus on? You know, to me, a lot of this really was, do I think VCU students, faculty and staff and visitors can respect each other enough to get through this? And I think the answer is yes, because that's what we're really pounding on. There's not as much science as we'd like. There's not as much certainty, but I have complete clarity that people's behaviors will be key to this. And, you know, there are some who argue that society has become increasingly self-oriented. And I'm not sure that's a good thing. That's just my personal opinion. I think we have to figure out, when we're human beings, social beings, how do we interact together thinking about each other and not just ourselves? That may be one of the greatest things that America can achieve through this. And I hope every other country can as well. So I'm betting on it. And that's where a lot of my plans have come from.
I love that. I absolutely hope you are right in that. And it worries me that so much of this is becoming partisan and such. But Dr. Kimbrough, how are you all going to handle the housing situation?
Yeah, pretty much the same thing. We'll offer some singles, but you know, as Dr. Rao mentioned, we're going to have a lot of that because I've already had students ask to say, you know, can we have roommates? And some actually had to serve as roommates this summer when a family member got sick, and so they got together on their own and have lived together. So that was part of it. So I think that's very important for them to learn those skills. And because, as we talked about, you know, you can have the students who are in the room, in the single room, but if they're still in that building together, they're going to congregate. So whether they're sleeping in that room together, they're going to still have some congregation. So I think you might even be able to cut down on some of that if you at least have a roommate, to not have as much of that. So we'll have lots of different options for students. There's a local institution, Southern University in New Orleans, that after Katrina, they're a commuter institution, but built residence halls. And we've had overflow for the last 4 years. And their residence halls are apartment style. So students can go there, have their own room. So we'll have places there. And then in New Orleans, this big hospitality industry with all these empty hotels, they're calling us all the time to say, hey, do you need beds? So we got beds for everybody. So that's not, you know, not going to be an issue, but I think we really will, you know, try to have people work together because I think that's going to be important.
That's a great idea, using the hotels, because obviously the hospitality industry has been hit particularly hard with all of this. Interesting. So the other big part of student life is obviously student athletics. I went to the University of Connecticut. I can tell you the entire state of Connecticut is desperate for the Huskies to come back. And so I think that is an indication of normalcy for folks. Peter, what do you think? How are college athletics going to return? What do you hear?
Yeah, so look, athletics is often seen as a front porch for colleges and universities in their communities and with their constituencies. Range of predictions. Let's presume that a fair number of folks say, well, athletics it begins with football. Not for every school, certainly, but for a lot of people. The summer will be an interesting test. It will be an interesting test of systems and responses as student athletes for the fall sports, football included, come back earlier than most other of their student and staff and faculty colleagues on campus. There's going to be a variety of approaches. It will depend upon the practical realities of what level schools are playing at, what intensity of summer practice. I know of at least one significant Division I conference that is tiering, shall we say, the risks of the risk factors, tiering by virtue of what type of sport, tiering by virtue of what type of person, student athlete being one example, a coach being another, a videographer being a third, a trainer in the training room being a fourth, and having different testing protocols for them, different experiences in terms of how often they'll be tested. We might very well see that at a certain type of institution, there will be testing on a Thursday for the entire football team before they travel to an away game in time to have the results back before they leave. Thinking about, as President Rao was talking about, the obligations not only to the community, but the obligation writ large to the hotels they travel to the other cities they travel to the airports they walk through. So there will be different experiences. And then at the other end of the spectrum, I suspect we will find that schools will say, we're going to just take a pause on our fall sports, and we will make a decision about our winter sports. One of the great things that happens at VCU each year is a rivalry with the University of Richmond. And I can guarantee that there's not a single VCU student that isn't at least wondering whether come 2021 in the winter, will I be able to go inside and scream and yell and watch a VCU Richmond game? I don't think anybody knows for sure. Well, what about the Ohio State fans that are counting on coming to a football game in September? Well, no, that's coming up on us a little faster. But this stuff is fluid. An interesting question is, when there isn't a student athlete tested, and the test that comes back positive, what are we going to do with that student athlete? And I think that it's probably going to be similar to most other campus community members. That athlete that's tested positive will probably be isolated in a dorm area that's set up for that. Treat it medically appropriately, test it at an appropriate time for return to the community more broadly and athletics more specifically. I think we'll just have to see how that all plays out.
Okay, so I just want to flag for the audience that I'm going to do a couple more questions, but we are going to turn to audience questions. So you can use the Zoom Q&A function. There's a YouTube chat, and you can also use Twitter at #BPC Live to submit your questions, and we'll turn to those in just a minute. One thing I wanted to touch on is there's a concern that a large number of the soon-to-be freshmen, so the kids you've just accepted, they might say, you know what, there's too much uncertainty about this, I'm not going to go, and they'll take a gap year or they'll defer. I read one study, I think said it could be up to, I thought it said 25%. And I think some of the larger schools can probably absorb that loss. I'm curious if what you're hearing and how you think the overall higher ed in general can recover from that. If you lose 25% of the students, they're gone for that whole cohort's 4 years. And so I'm just curious if anyone has some thoughts on that.
Let me speak to that. First thing, I think the big unknown is a lot of people are saying what they might do. We actually don't know these are very unusual circumstances. And to be honest, the idea of like taking a gap year, which is not going to be one of these gap years where you go to Kenya for a year and interact it's not going to be that. It's going to be home in your parents' basement, sort of. Mm-hmm. And that's its comparison. Like, look at that comparison. And so I think a lot of people who are saying now, well, I won't go. And what I think we're also seeing is a vocal small group just really getting out there a lot. But I actually wonder whether it's going to be as high as people think. At least some of the surveys have suggested, because when it comes to actually making decisions, the alternatives are not so great in a pandemic. And as flawed and as atypical as our schools will be, I think we're going to work really hard to make sure there's still sort of transformative educational experiences in all sorts of ways, and maybe in a richer way. I think this idea that, again, that Michael pointed out about, this is an opportunity for us to really live our values when it comes to sort of personal compromises for the common good. And that's what this is all about. Because most of our students aren't going to get terribly sick, and it's everyone else is going to get sick. And I think there's an opportunity for students to learn about and live that value of sacrifice, because everyone is sacrificing. But I'd be curious to see what my colleagues are saying about that.
Yeah, I would agree. I actually have done some focus groups last week with parents just to sort of get some ideas. And I didn't get a lot of concern about us opening. There are a couple that said, well, they're worried about more of the comorbidities that the family members might have, or a mom who said she has comorbidities, but still wanted the child to come back to school. I think for those who just finished high school, so, they didn't have their rite of passage to end high school. And now you're trying to tell them they won't have the next rite of passage to start college. So I'm not hearing that. I'm hearing, yes, I'm coming. I can't wait. As soon as you guys give the official green light, we're going. I'm hearing that from the parents to say, as soon as I can get them out the house. I have a 14-year-old and an 11-year-old. I want to see if I can send a 14-year-old to Iowa right now, because she's about to start a 9th grade, but I think we could just start her in college and go on to send her to Grinnell. I'm okay with that. But I mean, so I'm hearing some of that. The students are like, I'm tired of being here. And parents are like, I'm tired of them being here. And, for our population, high needs population, 75% Pell eligible, there is no such thing as a gap year. That doesn't exist for them. That means you're just sitting at home in the basement, and you might be working at CVS or McDonald's. And that's not appealing to anyone. So I think that a lot of people are going to try to make it work. And I think once we start moving in that direction even more forcefully, I think people will get on the bandwagon and say, I'm coming too. So that's what I expect. So yeah, we don't really know what it's going to look like. So you have these two forces, this unknown pandemic, but you're also in a recession now. And typically during a recession, there's an increase. So we really have no idea what's going to happen. So it will be interesting.
Well, I will say the teenage unemployment thing is legitimate. I have sons looking, and you say CVS, McDonald's, that I don't even know that it's really hard. So if they stay home, I don't know what they would be doing. But Dr. Rao, were you trying to?
Yeah, no, I would just add similar comments. There are lots of questions in the Q&A box about how you're connecting with students and faculty to get their opinions. We do what's called pulse surveying, so we never send more than 1 or 2 questions out, because we know the more you send out, the less you'll get people to even respond to it. But we have an app that has enabled students to just get back with us quickly. The return rate has been great. So early on, what we found was that there were a lot of students, and particularly new freshman prospects, who said, I don't know, I might take a gap year. But as time has gone on, what we found with a lot of those students is the reality hits that, well, what would I do then? And so they are looking to us in the spirit of answering that question about what are students saying. They're saying, what will you do to make this the fullest experience that we can possibly get? And so we are working toward that end, obviously respecting faculty. Our faculty is mixed. We obviously have some faculty members who are very nervous about all of this, very concerned about this. Many of those are more senior faculty members, and we're trying to find ways to respect those issues that they have concerns about. But at this point, our enrollment is, we have about 5%, maybe actually more like 3 or 4%. Who have not committed. And the reason they haven't committed is they want to see what the schedule looks like, and they want to go through that schedule and see which courses will be in person, which courses are going to be online, and they want to look at their whole schedule and say, if everything's online, then what am I doing? So that's one of the reasons we're working on so many freshman courses, to try and get them to be in person, even if it costs us a whole lot more. But the last thing I would say is that, Dr. Kimbrough, I hope that you will send that young lady to look at VCU also. A great option for her.
All right, so I'm going to turn to some of the Q&A on the chat. The first one is from Jay, and I think Peter, you covered some of this, but I am curious if anyone has some thoughts on this. So has any university looked at what is happening when schools have brought back their athletic teams? Every day, ESPN is reporting that returning football players at many schools are positive or test positive, but no one is discussing how those students will be quarantined for 2 weeks. Is this, anyone have thoughts on?
Well, let me just jump in quickly.
Yeah.
No one, maybe ESPN and a segment on the news, but everybody in the student life and athletic and president's office space on these campus are talking about that. They game plan for it. They are implementing their plans. And I can assure you that there isn't a school that has brought back student athletes for summer practice or is planning to bring them back that doesn't have a protocol that may be tweaked, may be revised, may be thrown out and replaced as there's learning. But there is absolutely reaction to positive testing. The real question is for each school, what's going to be the thing that causes the school to, if you will, scrap the protocol and go to plan B. I think every school is anticipating that there will be positive testing among athletic populations, among student populations, staff, faculty. The question is, what are we going to do upon having a positive test? And there's answers to that.
So the testing comes up, and I know, Dr. Rao, do you want to?
No, I was just going to add to that and say,
Yep.
I think we all pretty much have plans for athletics specifically. We certainly do, and very familiar with it. We have had students come back and we have quarantined them. We've isolated them, and then do what Pete said, and that is test coming in, but also test afterwards so that we know when the time is right for people in that 24-hour period to say, okay, it's okay for you to move out. And we are, as I mentioned, using the 14-day period. It's been tough, but we're doing that. Of course, we don't have football. We do have Division I basketball. I'm not saying it's our basketball players. I'm not going to identify anyone. It's a small team. But the reality is that not everybody in all of the sports that are back right now will have or will test negative. And so you have to have a plan for dealing with that, and we are in the process of executing that right now, as a matter of fact, and it's going very well. Great cooperation from student athletes. They're used to cooperating.
So since you're on the subject of testing, there's a question that came in from Rachel Fishman. Whose responsibility will it to be a test and trace? And I think this is beyond student athletes, but the student population and faculty in general. Is it the state and locality or your institution? And what are the financial implications for that?
So I'll take a stab at this and again, this is a highly variable from community to community. So we're in a small town and a small county. So we've worked with and we're having our own testing program that we're paying for with reserve funds that students aren't paying for it. We're paying for it through a separate fund. And we've worked it out with our county. So that what will probably happen is that anyone who has symptoms will go into a system where there's a separate clinic that you get tested, and then the public health department will trace those contacts, and then we will deal with mostly the asymptomatic testing, and we will trace the contacts for the asymptomatic or pre-symptomatic testing. So we've worked that out with our county and divided, and it's going to be a condition for coming back that students, among other things, will have to agree to have the tests disclosed to us. So that's going to be a condition. And then we have a whole series of protocols that are developing for the faculty and staff, because that's the other big source of potential infection. And that's a more complicated protocol. But again, we're working closely with the county to divide up responsibilities. We're training our own set of tracers. They have their tracers. And again, in a small community, that's much easier to do. It's a harder thing to do in a larger community.
We really think that testing and tracing is going to be a major responsibility of the university, but the tracing in particular has to be in conjunction with the State Department of Health, because ultimately you need some network to connect into for that tracing to be of any real value to the general population. But from a testing standpoint, we're a large institution. We do have a health system. Candidly, I probably could just do mass testing all the time, given the resources that we have accumulated and have. But I first have to remember that I am a hospital and health system, and I have to prioritize the clinically ill first. Then I have to prioritize healthcare workers. Then I have to prioritize students and faculty and staff with symptoms. And then we will go from there to some randomized testing in areas where we think that there are concern. Residence halls will obviously be some of those areas where we feel like we're picking up on, a larger number of symptoms. When I say areas, I want to be very clear that I'm actually opposed to testing people based on where they're coming from. And I will tell you why. A lot of people won't think of this because they're thinking scientifically. But if you're not careful, what you're really doing is you're testing largely Black people who come from a particular part of a state, and you just can't do that, right? Because then people start to feel like they're being targeted. So that's inappropriate. And so there are a lot of reasons why I feel like that's not good. But in a residence hall, absolutely something that we will give some consideration to. But what I'm talking about is areas on campus. And so 1 to 2% of the population will be tested. And we're talking about doing as much for employee testing as we can. More than anything, the reality is the science isn't going to be great with that. I'm talking population science, even though it's a fixed population, but it'll probably reduce anxiety. And ultimately, candidly, psyche is just as much valid as anything else in all of this that we're talking about.
Yeah, pretty similar for us. We actually talked about, we're really going to encourage everyone about 2 weeks before we start to do some testing on their own, just to have some baseline knowledge to know where they are, particularly those who are coming from out of town, just to sort of know. So if they know they're already positive, that they have a couple of weeks to quarantine then. So that would help. And then do testing of everybody when we start at the beginning of the year. We're working with the State Department of Health. Our medical director is actually linked into everything. He actually has a segment on our local NBC affiliate every night, and then he's on MSNBC every weekend. So I feel I'm comfortable. Whatever he says we're doing is whatever Corey says we're doing that. So he's really been on top of it, but we're really trying to work in partnership with the state. We've already done some free testing for the community on campus. The local institutions, there are about 8 higher education institutions, from community colleges to Tulane here. The presidents, we meet every couple of weeks. And so we're trying to leverage some resources to do some testing together. Tulane does have a medical system, but I think, like Dr. Rao, the same kind of priorities. So we're trying to leverage those resources together, maybe to work with the city, because a significant portion of the population in New Orleans is college students. So if we can partner with them to do some of that, to work with the State Board of Regents, the independent colleges in Louisiana. So everybody's still trying to work out the exact protocols. We will do some training for contact tracers as well. So we'll be able to do that, as well as to be able to leverage some of the electronic resources that we have. So a lot of places have added devices where students can swipe to, register their class attendance, but we'll be able to broaden that even for faculty and staff on campus. So if something happens, you will know where you've been, at least on campus that day, so to leverage some of those electronic resources as well. So we'll do a range of things, but we're still trying to work those out. And even in terms of the frequency, who gets tested, those kinds of things as well. Because I think, as we all have mentioned, that test is only good right then and there. I mean, you can go out the very next day and be infected. So it's, do you spend a lot of money trying to do a lot of that when it's only really good for that moment in time?
Great. Thank you all. A couple more from the chat. And I'm sorry if I get this wrong, your last name, but Jennifer Poulakaitis, I think that's right. While we all want things to return to normal, what changes do you think might stick for the long run? As you all have mentioned, the universities are undergoing tremendous changes right now. How much, any of that do you think is going to stick? Do more online?
So one thing is, a lot of professors who never would have tried online ever now have some experience, for better or worse. And I think there will be those who will say, maybe I should start using this technology in my class, no matter what we end up with when we return. And I think that's one thing. I also think this issue of vulnerable students, and I've been involved in a lot of issues about access, and I never really realized how much just moving someone to campus where they have time and they have food and they have a housing, just how much that moves toward leveling. Doesn't eliminate everything, but it just that. And now that really, I just never thought about that. Everyone had this idea that students went home and they, had their own room, and their parents brought up meals and they had Wi-Fi. And that's not the reality for a lot of students, and that's really driven home to me. That part of what we do is sort of we level the playing field just by giving people time and quiet and space. And I think that's a lot of people are thinking about that in ways they never thought about before.
100%, absolutely. That is the concern. In Louisiana, I think about 30% of all households don't have Wi-Fi internet access. And so I've seen, K through 12 teachers making copies of packets to give out to those students. So you can imagine how that impacts us as well. I hope we'll use some of the best practices from being online and leverage the technology, but I'm reading a lot of reports. I'm hearing directly from our students. We want to be back. We need to be connected. And one of my parent focus groups last week, one of the moms said she's responsible for hiring people all across the country. And she worries that students are missing some personal interaction and communication skills by not being in. So she just viewed it as an employer. She says, I'm really worried about who I'm going to be hiring because there are some skills that I'm afraid they're not developing in this format. So it was really interesting to hear that, from a parent to say, not just as a parent, but as an employer, I'm worried about those things. So I'm hearing overwhelmingly our folks, they want to be in that space together. That's what makes us who we are. So I agree, but there's still some things that we can use and leverage to do things, I think, more efficiently.
Yeah, I think there are a lot of things to Jennifer's question. Good question. A lot of things will stick. And I think everyone's, it's a hackneyed term, but this whole concept of a new normal, which everyone's sick of hearing, it really will be a different environment. And maybe, let's be optimistic that, the pride that we've taken in higher education of the resiliency is going to erode a bit. And it needs to. The reality is our students have for a very long time been trying to tell us that they learn in different ways. They are trying to tell us that we have to do different things different ways. One good example is think about this generation and the ways in which they interact with anything that they pay for. They expect it to come to their phone. They expect it to come to them. And so one of the things that I really hope sticks, and I think it will at VCU, is advising in particular. Our advisors all got out and connected with students. I do think that our students want to be interactive with our advisors, but no matter whether they're on campus or not, they may not always have the time to go to an advisor. But our advisors have really been pushing, meaning sending out pushes to students saying, have you done this? Or have you registered for your fall classes? And did you include this course and this course and this course? And so I know that activity has increased dramatically and it needs to stay. It needs to continue. The other thing that I think is really cool is the number, and Raynard and Dr. Kimbrough both said something about this. And the number of faculty members who have told me they didn't think they were capable of doing such cool digital multimedia. And so whether you're in the classroom or whatever, the bottom line is some of that stuff really does help a generation that has looked at life through screens in many ways. And so I don't care what it takes. I'm not going to judge that. I learn differently, but it's not about me anymore. This is about how will people learn more effectively and become the kinds of professionals that they want to become. Well, they need to know a lot of the things that we think they need to know. So how we teach them hopefully will change forever and become a permanent way of better connecting with the generation that really wanted to see change.
So one thing that, go ahead, Peter. Yeah,
I was just going to pick up on a theme here, which leads to resiliency. We talk a lot in education about resiliency and teaching it, and Well, if we're lifelong learners, we've had faculty and staff that turned on a dime in mid-March and figured out how to do things they never did. We had students figure out how to do the same and their families. And as we come back, we're going to have social resiliency. We're going to hopefully say, look, I have respect for my fellow students and community members. It's not going to be the same. Let's figure out how to make it the best it possibly can. And there's learning that comes from that. Those soft skills of it wasn't perfect. It wasn't what I expected, but darn, we're going to make it the best we possibly can. There could be 5-10 years from now, reflection by this group of students that say, I wouldn't have wished anybody lived through it, but boy, I'm glad I did.
That would be great. So I know we're coming up on the close. I just want to end with one question to all of our panelists. So if you can speak to the parents now who are debating what to do, and it sounds like most are ready to send their kids, but what is one final message you would send to them as they're trying to make that final call?
Yeah, I would say that's a great question. I really think that there will be some inconveniences ahead of us, but this is really an opportunity to send your student into an environment in which they will learn how to deal with problems together. We have a major public health problem. And so being in the basement or in the attic or whatever is not really going to help to make you a participant in this. And I'm assuming, of course, for students who don't have compromised immune systems and such. But remember, life is really about assessing risk on a daily basis. And candidly, part of how you eliminate a lot of that risk is with your own behavior and whether or not you really think about other people and how your behaviors affect other people. And so we talk all the time here in the hospital about safety. Well, safety isn't just something that belongs in the hospital, it's something that belongs everywhere, because if you really care about other people, they will be safe. If we take care of each other, we'll all be safe. And so being courteous and it sounds really crazy and people get sick of hearing me talk about this, but really washing your hands. I don't think most people really wash their hands very well. And yes, maybe you're immune now because you've had grubby hands for a long time, but what about everybody else you interact with? And do you really think about that? So I think in places like ours, even in small rural towns, wherever you are, colleges can be part of the solution to taking us as human beings to the next level. This pandemic has been horrible. We all know it. It has disproportionately affected people who we least wanted it to affect. We're trying to lift the people that were affected the worst. And I don't like that a bit. But how can colleges and universities, from an economic perspective, be a part of lifting everyone and bringing the human experience to the next level? We've got to be a part of envisioning that. And a lot of that's going to be instilling in our students, how do you really care about everybody else that you're around and not just yourself? This is not a movie about just any one of us. It's about all of us together. And colleges, if we do it right, can help to make that happen.
Great.
No, what you said was great. I think we may get a generation transformed in the same way that the Depression transformed a generation. People didn't think about themselves and their relationship to others in the same way after the Depression. And I think we'll have students having a similar transformative experience as well.
Yeah, I agree. It's a great opportunity. People just have to have patience, but it's an opportunity to do something that no one's ever seen before. No one's had to deal with anything like this. And so I think we have to sort of lean into this moment is what I, tell students and parents and even folks on campus. Let's lean into this moment and think about how we're going to handle this situation. So, we have to get excited about it. It's scary too, but how do we have this sort of, adventurous experience? I was just saying, it's sort of like at the beginning of the 1960 Star Trek television show, the boldly go where no man has gone before is sort of what we're doing right now. So to lean into that, I think is the way I'm looking at it.
Great. Well, with that, I will bring us to a close. I cannot thank you enough for being part of it. It was an honor to be here with all four of you, an incredibly distinguished panel. And thank you to everyone who joined us live. This will live on our website if people want to go back and review it. But in the meantime, be safe, everyone. And thank you to all of our panelists. This was tremendous.